Extras. So after ending the Polaron arc with TDDC 40, it was the right time for a Legends video. As much as I'm always trying to restrain myself to sort of the minimum needed art to convey things, except for a few key visuals, Legends videos are mostly where I try to push my art in some way, like the rudimentary action of The Smith, or the experiment with visual storytelling in Angel's Master. Eventually I want to do one on Little One's mother, but I wanted at least one more high-action video to test and practice before I tackle the dragon. And that's why I chose this story of The Winter Palace. Then, after working for weeks, recording the audio and doing all the base character designs, I realized what I was doing was too ambitious, and there was no way I could finish it properly within 2 months and have it turn out the way that I wanted. So I switched over and made Sand, which was a short story and much more of a bottle story. Very few characters, only one of whom was a person requiring any artistic effort. The main setting is the desert, which I can mostly fudge with 2 rectangles, one sand color, one sky color. So I felt I could crank out Sand and get it done with the polish it deserves in a much more reasonable time frame, despite having sunk 2 to 3 weeks into something else. Winter Palace is still coming, but it's going to have to wait at least 1 or 2 TDDC episodes because I don't want to make people wait even longer. Okay, as a Legends video, like conceptually, separate from my actual execution, Sand has both pros and cons. The pro is that I feel it's a strong, tight fairy tale of a story, a proper legend. The con is that, unlike the Winter Palace video, it is not a story that is well tied into the lore or history of the world of TDDC. We get to see almost an example of how certain spirits, the archetypical bargain-making spirits, interact, and I think it does add that element to the texture of the setting. However, as much as I wrote this story a while back as taking place in this world, and to become part of this world, as much as I tried to work Bennett and her further adventures into the D&D campaign, or even into the history of the setting, I found that I couldn't. And the reason is that this power is too great. Fun facts, the Black Ooze is not Benzagagoth, the spirit the party freed in the Shadowfell in TDDC 28. However, Penataxix is no shit written to be Benzagagoth's brother. Whatever it means to be brothers as immortal beings which may or may not even have been born. Hopefully the spirit the PCs freed was not a wantonly cruel dick like Penataxix. But at minimum, Benzagagoth had some kind of nobility about him. I needed a voice for the Djinn that was super confident, starting out magnanimous and, of course, very distinct from the ominous guttural blob voice that I used for the tar-like demon. Some noted the voice I went for is very similar to the voice I used for Wormy, but what I was going for here was more like a sinister version of Jonas Venture Jr. Bennett is a last name. The character's first name is never given. This was true in the original draft of the short story, but in that first draft, this character was actually a young man. Because if you don't think about it, if you aren't conscious of what you're doing, there's a strong tendency, a strong bias, to write characters you empathize with as similar to yourself. When I looked at making this into a video, I decided to gender flip her, partly because there are just not enough female protagonists in my content in general, and many figures in upcoming Legends videos are much more gender-locked in my mind. But also, once I thought about it, I liked her better. I find her more interesting as a young woman for some reason. Obviously, without attempting to sexualize her in any way. Also, I kept meaning to go back and add a chimney to the cabin, especially since the wood furnace is specifically mentioned, but in the end, I forgot. Oops. I really would have liked to give her sweaty armpits almost as soon as she entered the desert, but because I used the matching sleeve and shirt colors to sort of cut corners on the art, especially anywhere the art moves, it would actually have taken a bunch more work, or just looked a lot worse, to incorporate the stains. So the short story on which the video is based was written to do two things. One, to be a really solid, fun, satisfying little original fairy tale. Two, and this evolved partway through the writing of it, to be the starting point for a series of tales, probably a novel, which follow our protagonist, and the fun of which is basically abusing the powers she gained from this little origin story. Because the bowl is a little powerful, but Bennett's ability to count like a djinn is an inconceivable cosmic power, and abusing it to the maximum would be a crazy fun exploration. Great light adventures. Spoilers, I'm probably never going to write these adventures. Too many stories, not enough time. Sorry. Now, at this point, some of you are like, that's insane. How can instant counting be so overpowered? The rest of you are probably like, that's insane. What story do you even write for a protagonist with this godly power? Let's get on the same page about what this power is. In the world of TDDC, spirits are different from mortals in many ways. For example, even the spirits who look and act like mortals, running around fighting or playing or whatever, even they cannot truly be destroyed. If they have a mortal form that can be slain, or if a more abstract-bodied spirit is magically obliterated, either way, they still exist on the astral plane, but may be weakened significantly and may lose their ability to come back and to interact directly with the material planes, with the physical world. But another thing is that spirits of the types who engage in bargaining, curses, all that weird mystical fairy tale junk, some of their magic works differently than any normal magic. When a spirit is making a bargain or a prophecy or laying down a curse, within that context, they can often access information far beyond what even the greatest divination spells can achieve. They can, in many cases, know every detail of an individual's history, thoughts, and desires, or even elements of their future, in order to create a binding celestial contract. For example, they may know that in the future you would likely violate a bargain in a specific manner, allowing them to tailor the agreement in their favor, whether their aim is for you to keep or to break the contract. Or, in the process of cursing an individual, they may learn your greatest fear, or the thing that would torture you the most, that even you do not consciously realize. They can possess this great knowledge, or maybe be influenced by the information without consciously knowing it, when making the deal or enforcing a deal, and yet still not have access to that information before or after. If you make a bargain that would be broken, subjecting you to a curse or to the spirit's physical vengeance, should you ever betray them, or should you speak a certain word, the spirit that made the bargain may have no idea where you are, no way to sense your actions at all, yet become instantly aware if and when you were to break that deal. It is this ability to gain information in ways totally different from ordinary divinations, with a completely different set of limitations, that led one Rakshasa to completely change her worldview, embrace lawfulness in the cosmic beyond this world sense, and to become the first Raj, researching and discovering the tools that the current Rajas use in TDDC. But getting back to the story, the power granted to Bennett, while based on similar principles, pulling information as though from the very fabric of the universe, such powers are normally never bestowed upon mortal beings. To do so is costly to the spirit, and also very dangerous. When you ask a demon, jinn, whatever you want to call them, and yes, proper wish-granting genies are a specific type of them, when you ask them a question with a numerical answer, they instantly know the answer, at least during that brief moment, but they choose whether or not to share that answer. They also have a number of supernatural limitations of the beyond your comprehension variety. As a presumably unprecedented boon bestowed upon a mortal, what Bennett has functions under somewhat different set of limitations. It cannot answer any question that reveals the health of a specific individual. This means she cannot tell you how many more days she or anyone else will live, how many functioning organs they currently have, etc. There are some edge cases where it may be possible to extrapolate some of this type of information from the answers, but in general, and the vast majority of the time, it can't be used to tell whether a person somewhere in the world is alive or dead, or how long they will live. Also, the power can only answer true counting questions. So you can't assign numbers to multiple choice answers, nor can you use a complex series of Boolean, like 0 or 1, true or false questions to perform logical operations like a digital computer. It just won't work. And, like a spirit, her power does not work if she asks the question herself. Unlike a spirit, she has no control over this power. If she perceives any question with a numerical answer that she can understand, and which might possibly be addressed to her, she will immediately state the answer at normal speaking volume, if it is physically possible for her to do so. If you weren't getting it before, just hearing what few limitations there are might have just made you realize this is not a parlor trick. This is an insane power. Like, not quite Death Note powerful, but maybe in the same league. In the hands of a strategist with even the slightest modicum of imagination, this level of divination could easily win wars. How many days until this castle is next attacked? How many hours? How many minutes? How many enemy soldiers in the next attack? How many cavalry? How many archers? How many monsters? How many monsters larger than an elephant? How many monsters larger than a hill giant? How many of the enemy can fly? How many can tunnel faster than a human with a shovel? How many siege engines have they brought? How many days would it take their siege engines to breach our walls? How many heroes among them are strong enough to defeat our champion in single combat? How many soldiers will attack from the east side? How many from the north? And that might be thinking small. Although you can't cheat Bennett's power with multiple choice questions or logical operations, imagine what you could accomplish using traditional divinations first to gather qualitative information, then using her unlimited counting power to quantify based on that data. Hell, those of you familiar with Another Gaming comic and their Second Evil campaign may know that Baron von Stanthold already did things similar to this using traditional D&D divinations, but even he was limited by his daily spell slots. With Bennett tied up, he could have nearly unlimited foreknowledge. He would have built a construct programmed to ask her questions non-stop based on predetermined algorithms so he could squeeze out as much information as possible without wasting his personal time on it every day. If the Rajas, or their enemies, the Mind Hunters, got a hold of Bennett, what they could do boggles the mind. And that is why I actually found I could not incorporate her and her power into the campaign after all. No matter how hard I tried, limiting it takes away from what the power means to me, the whole fun of it. But it's so strong that, like a massive source of gravity, it could warp everything around it. The entire campaign, in many ways the fate of the world, would almost have to revolve around using and abusing this power, or killing her to prevent that power from being used by others. It wasn't where I wanted to go. So while this legend, what you see in the video, is canon, afterward she just kind of disappeared into history. The real story that she deserves has to remain more of a what-if, like an alternate universe story. As I mentioned earlier, when writing the fairy tale portion initially, I realized it would be very cool to make that the origin story of the character and turn her further adventures into a novel. A novel centered around going just utterly wild with abusing this power, showing how much she could wreck things up in the world. The problem is, it's actually a difficult book to plot out in order to achieve maximum awesomeness. And the real problem is, I already have two other major stories I want to tell, not counting TDDC and a planned spin-off. I don't know when I'd be able to work on them, and Bennett's Tale, while conceptually super fun, the details of it currently don't excite me the way the plot and cool details of my steampunk story do, or the way the sci-fi ideas and great characters of my space opera do. So the counting novel is just never going to get written, similar to the continuation of my Infinite Hall fantasy novella, available for download on my Patreon if you give $4 or more for even 1 month. The problem is, ideas are a dime a dozen. Judging from the comments on TDDC, a lot of you find my ideas to be of above average quality, which does make me proud. But whether they're my ideas or J.J. Abrams or Joss Whedon's ideas, they aren't worth much unless and until somebody puts in the effort to make something out of them. Having said that, I'm confident that I am not going to write Bennett's book, so I can just go nuts here, giving away some of the cool ideas or scenes that made me love the concept so much. So here we go. After the events of the video, and or the short story is based on, Bennett is left at the edge of the desert, near some thin stands of hardy trees, with only the magic bowl and the clothes on her back. Although I cheaped out and reused the trees from the cabin scene, she actually has no idea where she is, even what direction her home was, so she's effectively starting fresh. Whole new life. The Black Spirit Penataxics gave her that copper bowl to prolong and intensify her suffering. But now that she's free, it at least guarantees she won't die of thirst or starvation as long as she has it. So she wanders for a couple days until she comes upon a dirt road, and from there she picks a direction, figuring either way she's bound to reach civilization eventually. She runs into a caravan, who seem decent and take her along. When they are accosted by bandits in denser woods, with warning shots fired from all around them, 3 bandits step out and demand the caravan surrender all their coin. But as the merchants are looking all around nervously, one asks rhetorically, "How many of these bandits are there?" To which Bennett immediately answers, 5. The merchants are like, "What do you mean 5? They're all around us." But the 3 they can see look a little surprised, and Bennett bluffs that she's heard about these guys and how they operate, and claims they're using tricks, but there are only a couple more than what you can see. The uncertainty, especially with the sudden nervousness of the previously confident bandits, is enough that the merchants decide to resist, and the bandits are forced to flee, leaving behind the crude arrow traps they use to inflate their apparent numbers. When Bennett gets to town, she needs to make some money somehow. The caravan leader gives her a tiny amount of coin, like enough for a loaf of bread, out of pity and for help with the bandit thing, and she tries to use her power to cheat at gambling, though she almost screws up, learning that it doesn't work if she asks herself the question. Because she's new to this magical powers thing, she realizes a little late that she needs to lose some bets to throw off suspicion, and though she does that, she ends up being ambushed and taken prisoner by a local crime gang. The gang asks her a lot of questions, and at least once they trigger her counting power. They don't quite figure out what's up, but they know there's something strange about her. The crime gang also captures the leader of those bandits, pissed off because he owes them money, and Bennett ends up working with this bandit to escape before they go their separate ways. Moving on to another town, Bennett does some odd jobs along the way, like helping herd sheep, where she gets a young child to ask her how many there are periodically, and on the 3rd day she finds out some are missing, which she reports, and the herders become alerted to a hidden danger much sooner than they normally might have been. She meets like a money changer, who she convinces she can count and estimate weights and measures incredibly quickly and accurately. She works with them for a time and ends up catching the attention of a bank manager and working counting the vault. There, she quickly runs out of excuses and has to confess her magical ability, but the manager takes it as a blessing. I don't care if it's witchcraft. It's some damn good witchcraft. And pays her well to stay on for a while. The town becomes besieged, and with the bank manager's help, she lies about having served as a scout and a military commander's aide-de-camp, and talks her way, with a demonstration or two, up to assisting the captain of the town's defenders. She helps the captain to plan her defense and react to enemy movements in such a way that they save the town, though she is forced to confess her power to the captain partway through. But the Lord, who had sent his raiders, tries to find out how this pathetic little town was able to stop his forces, and his spies, along with a spirit in the Lord's employ, put together the suspicions they heard from the crime gang with some other evidence to guess Bennett's superpower. So the Lord has her captured and dragged down to his dungeon, and he begins abusing her power like a proper mastermind, chiding her on her lack of vision. Remember, she has no control over the power. If she hears a question and is not physically prevented from answering, she answers. The Lord later finds out about her copper bowl, and while disappointed to learn through experimentation that it only worked for her, he left her the bowl and stopped feeding her because it allowed her to go without sleep, so he or his advisors in general could question her at any hour of the day or night. Though the bowl removed the need and desire to sleep, and left her enough energy to walk around and function, more than enough for her prison cell, going without sleep in this way left her feeling constantly fatigued, and as the sleepless nights wore on, it left her mind worn down, irate, nervous, depressed, or some combination of the three. It was hard to tell if hopelessness was a part of that, or merely a symptom of her situation. For a while she struggles and fights back, unable to control her answers, but being as much of a pain in the ass as possible, shouting at them, etc. The Lord reacts by having her chained down, even stopping the servants from cleaning her cell and clothing, though he lets his advisors do more of the questioning as it gets vile in there, until she loses the will to resist, pleading that she'll behave and cause no more trouble if they leave her free in her cell and clean up. That's what happens. She behaves, and they leave her free in her cell. Bennett does the Lord's bidding because she literally has no control over her gift, but she learns much of his plans and his evils through his questions. She shares this information with the most ambitious of the advisors who questions her demon counting in the Lord's stead, giving this advisor the information which could help to undermine the Lord. When the advisor stages her coup, she sends soldiers to execute Bennett, which would be quite a loss, but she knew how treacherous Bennett could be. Bennett is warned by one of the servants, but she's locked in a cell. What can she even do? In desperation and or sleep deprivation, she grabs the copper bowl and shouts at it, "You're supposed to make enough water to keep me alive, so keep me alive!" But she is actually utterly shocked when the bowl in fact reacts by filling rapidly with water, then overflowing, then full-on blasting out water like a fire hose. She tries to figure out how to use it on the guards when the door opens, but the cell rapidly fills up with water, making that impractical. It completely fills, spraying water out of the bars of the door, floating her up to the high window, but as she struggles to reach for it, it's of course barred, and she has no way to get through. But when the executioners do open the door, bracing themselves because they can see the water spraying out, the cell drains out into the hallway in a torrent, and Bennett grasps the bowl, which projects a massive gusher of water, propelling her past the floundering guards, allowing her to make a harrowing escape. Barely. When she gets free of the Lord's, now the lady's, state, she runs into that same darn bandit again, once again thrust on the same side of things, and they end up forming a relationship. They fall in love. They get themselves to a good place, with enough money to be comfortable. They seem poised to live happily ever after. But one afternoon, lying together, both content, the bandit says soothingly and rhetorically, "How many great loves do you have in a lifetime?" And Bennett answers, "Two." They're both stunned by the unintended and unwanted information. When they get over the initial shock, trying to process what it means, the bandit then asks, "How many great loves do I have in a lifetime?" The answer is 3. They've talked about their histories enough to know that neither of them has been in a serious relationship before. And though they're both in love and both happy, this knowledge hurts them both and makes it so hard to continue as they had. If the counts had been 2 and 1, then it could mean that whichever of them died first, the other found love again. But if they each had more than one, that must mean that they split up. It's sad and probably stupid to go by all this fate crap, but the human heart doesn't operate on logic, and so, reluctantly, they separate. Bennett runs off to have even more crazy adventures. In their time together, Bennett had learned to fight at least a little, so she wasn't just a pawn of anyone who used force against her anymore. But she still goes around, tries treasure hunting, has encounters with weird spirits and other creatures, some friends, some foes. As long as she has some companion, she can tell them what to ask her and use her power to find things that are thought lost or hidden, to bypass traps and laugh their way through puzzles, dungeon crawling, etc. But after years, maybe decades, of adventuring, abusing the hell out of her power, becoming an epic hero and an important figure, she runs into the bandit again. The bandit had taken a spouse in the meantime, but that spouse had recently died, and Bennett tried to comfort this friend through the sorrow, because she still loved this person, and they loved her in return. And as they are united again, they fall in love with each other again, and realize that maybe Bennett's second and the bandit's third great love could be each other, coming together a second time. The power may have made fools of them both, robbing them of a decade they could have been together, but each had grown and done so much while they were apart, and being reunited after so many years of conscious and unconscious yearning may have made their love that much stronger. And this time they do live happily ever after. More or less. I'll note that I've tried to avoid using any pronouns referring to the bandit. I know I screwed up a couple places already. Because Bennett's female, my instinct is to automatically make the love interest male, because I'm a cisgendered heterosexual, so that's my natural bias. But in the summary above, the parts of the story that interest me, there's nothing about reproduction. The focus is on two people falling in love, then being pushed apart due to circumstances, then longing and trying to fill that hole for years, then rediscovering each other and their love. That could be two people of any description. So, at the concept level, I should at least leave it open for something other than two cis hetero people. Anyway, that's the core of the story I wanted to tell. But again, I don't have time, and I would just get bogged down in parts that a good writer would embrace, but which to me are just would feel like filler and pacing, and I'd probably never finish it anyway. I like what I have outlined above as a story, but I'm not excited by the everything in between that is needed to make it a full and proper tale. And even skipping from one of these parts to the next, I think would lose a lot of the emotion and the impact that could be achieved through better writing and slowly building all the characters. Back to the video. Again, I chose this to replace the other legend in the short term because it was a much smaller scale project. But then I realized there was nothing but Bennett on screen for most of the runtime. I realized I had to do more than 3 to 4 static pics of her. I was going to have to spend some effort making facial expressions. I found some anime examples to imitate, for the eyes especially, because in art, imitating somebody who knows what the hell they're doing is how you start out. For most prospective artists, you need to be on the right track before you can make it your own. When I'm copying a complex photographic image, like the tiger heads of the Rakshasas in TDDC, I usually trace the image. Tracing from a photo to vector art is itself an artistic process which greatly changes the underlying image. You're simulating the shapes, choosing what details to keep and what to throw, and what details need to be abstracted to look real in a vector image. For something as comparatively simple and streamlined as anime facial expressions, I usually don't trace. I copy the look on my own, which I still find trickier than it looks, because hand-drawn or tablet-painted images look very different from my vector art in a number of ways. It's the same reason I find it very hard to do good hair, something I could, with a little practice, actually do better freehand. And I suck at real drawing. But anyway, I can't do eyes the way I see them in anime because I can't control lines in the same way. But they guide me to something that looks okay. So I save time by having such simple backgrounds and such abstract spirit characters, and yes, they were always written that way. Even though the story was not originally intended to be a video, both the black puddle of tar and the perfect cylinder of sand have a primal aspect to them. Like platonic ideal shapes, they convey an alienness which, when combined with their behavior, in some way amplifies your sense of them as powerful beings in a way that you don't get from anthropomorphic creatures or anything with a face. Or at least, it would be harder. But I ended up spending a chunk of that time that I would have saved in order to use more and slightly more subtle facial expressions beyond the handful I made for, say, Liz. And making so much additional eye movement in order to convey just enough emotion to carry this story, so much of which is internal. So there are some bits of animation I liked and some parts I don't like as much. Like when the cylinder makes itself huge, I was unable to convey the looming threat the way I wanted to, because I couldn't figure out how to really make it work within the dimensions of the screen. There are even bits that I both like and don't like, such as Bennett skidding to a stop at the end of the wind journey. Overall, I think the skidding looks and works great, but the details of it are poor. Because to make it any better would have taken a bunch more work and or skill, and for the, 1 second it's on screen, it conveys what it needs to convey. There were a bunch of questions from Rachel Walmsley and Jay By the Way on the Patreon preview wanting to know more about how Bennett's counting power works, including what if you ask a question that is impossible to answer correctly, and what if you ask a question where your intention is to change your behavior depending on the answer, which would in turn invalidate the answer. The universe will only give correct answers. Questions that cannot be answered will not be answered. Whether it breaks one of the rules, or is definitionally impossible, or if the very answer itself would change the count. For example, if you ask how many of your soldiers would die in the upcoming battle, with the intention of avoiding the battle if the number is too high. Now, if your intention is to trick and manipulate things by trying to change your actions based on the answer to prevent bad outcomes, knowing that no answer means the true answer would have changed the outcome, that might work for a while, but you are bound to get screwed eventually, because sometime you're going to ask that question, hear that 0 of your soldiers will die, go into battle, and it turns out all the soldiers end up crippled, or captured, and maybe executed later, or die of their wounds after the battle is over. It isn't necessarily the universe trying to screw you, but you are bound to get burned eventually if you try to treat the answers themselves as avoidable. Of course, some of the fun of the story is situations where you ask a question and get an answer which seems impossible because you know it will come to pass. Rachel also asked, if she's abusing her ability in this way, wouldn't certain beings in the world of TDDC detect this and come after her? And that's part of why, in the actual canon world of TDDC, I think Bennett counted her blessings and stuck to a relatively normal life, thus slipping under the radar of those beings at the intersection of power and divination ability, like the Rajas, or much worse, the Mindhunters. In her own story, though, where she goes all out, spirits would cross her path increasingly over time, and I'm sure that when she goes adventuring, after that thing happens, there would almost have to be some serious devil comes down to Georgia level battles of wits. And she better hope she makes a few spirit friends to balance out the enemies and opportunists. There are some kinds of spiritual beings, or even non-spirit monsters, who could drain or consume a boon like hers from a mortal. Almost certainly they wouldn't gain her ability, but that degree of power does have uses. Anyway, I hope you liked Legends Sand, and I'm sure it's not what you were looking for, but I'm back to working on TDDC, and I still have a good chunk of the next Legends done for me to work on later. I want to give a huge thanks to all my generous Patreon patrons, with a special shout out to Pericles, Lord Aben, Tyranno MCG, Zombie, and Sarosh, the current members of the organization, and other valiant members who contributed to the organization tier for more months than episodes they appeared in because I'm so slow. And if you can't afford to contribute financially, or just don't feel like it, remember, it doesn't cost you a dime to like and share Tales from My D&D campaign.